Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our fourth installment of our land development series. Today's title is The Crisis in Housing, Vanquishing the Ghost of Euclid, or is it really a vampire? Couple quick housekeeping items. Please be sure to name yourself, your actual name, and have your camera on if you are interested in receiving credits for professional engineer, land surveyor, and landscaped architect. Feel free to use the chat if you're not sure how to rename yourself, or if you have any questions for staff on the call throughout this presentation. So without further ado, I will get started. I'm sure most of you know our speaker by now, one of the most prolific and high-profile members of the engineering and development communities. He is surely the most credentialed engineer in Maryland. If he gets any more letters behind his name, he'll need bigger business cards. He was the founding president of the Land Development Council, and last year, he was named the top professional engineer in the United States, having previously won the top professional engineering award in Maryland, now known as the Thaler Prize, and Maryland's highest military honor, the Distinguished Service Cross. But you probably know all that. I'd like to tell you some things you probably don't know about him. In addition to hundreds of articles, he has published 5 books of literary criticism, one co-authored with Larry Gibson, the biographer of Thurgood Marshall, and another with Marian Elizabeth Rogers, the biographer of H.L. Mencken. His firm, D.S. Thaler and Associates, has developed numerous state-of-the-art land development techniques, and he invented super silt fence, now an international standard. A surveyor as well as an engineer, he discovered the original transit instrument used by Mason and Dixon in their iconic survey of 1762 to 1767, fought with the Smithsonian to prove its provenance and won, and ran a national fundraising campaign to have the instrument restored. In an event at the Maryland Historical Society, he donated it as a gift to the nation from the Surveyors of America. Just after Glasnost, he was sent on a mission by the United States State Department, where he lectured at the Northwest Cadastral Institute in the Leningrad Oblast to assist with the privatization of property in Russia for the first time since the Russian Revolution. However, perhaps his greatest claim to fame is that he is likely the only man to have ever performed at the inaugurations of numerous governors, mayors, and county executive without wearing trousers. He was the bagpiper. So please welcome David Thaler.
Thank you, Carrie. Am I unmuted? Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the fourth episode of our land development course. I want to talk about what I believe is a crisis in America, exacerbated, of course, by the COVID, but still very structural. And I don't mean climate change or lumber prices, although they may be crises as well. The crisis I want to talk about today, and a possible cause and solution, is the lack of housing that people can afford and the startling increase in homelessness. Currently, over 500,000 people go homeless every night in the United States. About 65% are found in homeless shelters, and the balance, just over 200,000, are found on the streets, living on sidewalks or in parked cars or in abandoned buildings. About half, 47%, of all unsheltered homeless people are found in the state of California, which perhaps surprisingly for such a rich state has the highest poverty rate in the nation. Not so surprisingly, it also leads the nation in income equality. In 2018, there was a 2.7% increase in homelessness nationally, but as of January 2020, California itself experienced the extraordinary increase in homelessness to about 150,000 souls. San Francisco now has about 18,000 homeless, and LA County about 55,000. And the average cost of a home in the Bay Area is a whopping $996,000, and the median cost of a home in San Francisco is about $1.3 million. Overall in California, the average price of a home exceeds $500,000. Now, to afford an average home in San Francisco, you need to earn almost $200,000 a year, and the median monthly rent for a one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco reached $3,700 a month in 2019, the highest anywhere in the United States. The state is politically dominated by progressives who profess to care for the poor and underserved, but the people progressives claim to care about the most can't afford to live there. And every year, about 300,000 more people leave California than enter. But you certainly can't say that California isn't woke. The San Francisco School Board, just this year, in the middle of COVID, with schools closed, voted to rename 44 schools to strip them of their purported racist history. However, they also included a school named for Senator Dianne Feinstein, who, as far as I know, never owned slaves. Now, in some parts of San Francisco, you can't walk 15 feet without seeing a Black Lives Matter sign, yet these signs sit in yards and windows zoned for only single-family dwellings in communities that vigorously oppose any effort to build new homes, which would bring the values of equality professed by progressives closer to reality. Poorer families, disproportionately immigrant and non-white, are forced into long commutes, overcrowded housing, and homelessness, and these inequities turned deadly during the pandemic. It is difficult to remain socially distant in overcrowded homes with 10 or 15 occupants. However, the opposition to new housing is quite bipartisan. Blue cities are full of people who say they want a more equitable society, but will fight to the death to make sure affordable housing or apartments are not built anywhere near them. Red suburbs, too, are full of folks who believe that regulation should be minimal and property rights protected, and yet insist their local governments enact oppressive rules to make construction of new homes as difficult and as expensive as possible. There are about 4,000 homeless every night right here in Baltimore. And if you think that homelessness is not a local problem, drive with me one day down Martin Luther King Boulevard in Baltimore City, where there are homeless on every corner. Now, homelessness is caused by many factors, of course: unemployment, poverty, substance abuse, lack of job skills, and mental illness, among others. In the 1970s, state mental health facilities were deinstitutionalized, and the goal was to provide mental health support services in the community, but that has not quite worked out as intended. However, the main cause of homelessness is simple and unsurprising. It's the lack of housing that lower income people can afford. The advocates for the homeless will tell you that the key to stabilizing all of these other issues contributing to homelessness is a permanent housing solution. So why is housing so unaffordable? There are labor shortages and material costs, especially now with lumber costs skyrocketing. However, the principal cause, along with community opposition, is simply over-regulation. According to the White House Council on Eliminating Regulatory Barriers to Affordable Housing, these regulations include overly restrictive zoning and development controls, rent control, cumbersome building and rehabilitation codes, unreasonable maximum density limitations, historic preservation requirements, overly burdensome wetland environmental regulations, outdated manufactured housing regulations, excessive parking requirements, cumbersome and time-consuming permitting and review procedures, tax policies, over-complex labor requirements, and exorbitant development fees. And there are many more that could have been cited, including here overly restrictive forest conservation laws and stormwater management. Now, few Americans lived in the street post-war because housing was cheaper. At that time, only 1 in 4 tenants spent more than 30% of their income on rent, and today more than 1 in 2 do. In 2016, the National Association of Home Builders estimated the average cost of regulation in a new home at an unbelievable $85,000. Now, planning departments and county councils are certainly aware of this problem, but the usual solution is more regulation, typically rent control or inclusionary zoning, requiring developers to construct more affordable housing. But sometimes planners seem oblivious that the cause of the homelessness and the lack of affordable housing is simply overregulation, and the solution is not more of the same. On January 17, 2020, just last year, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order to address the homelessness crisis in California. It included identifying excess state land for use as temporary housing, assessing the availability of vacant and decommissioned hospitals and healthcare facilities for use as temporary housing, identifying fairground land for use as temporary housing, and making available 100 travel trailers and providing modular tent structures, again, for use as temporary housing. Now, even though these measures are but Band-Aids, the governor did not even attempt to address the root cause of homelessness, overregulation in California, which makes the construction of new housing much less affordable and so difficult. Now, there are perhaps hundreds of regulations which add to the cost of housing. Impact fees of $50,000 roughly a home in Montgomery County are perhaps among the most notorious. But the most ubiquitous regulation, and in my view, the most insidious cause of homelessness and lack of affordable housing, is zoning, and especially a particular type, Euclidean zoning, which happens to be the most popular type of zoning in the nation. Now, zoning appeared rather suddenly in America without many precedents. The first zoning case to reach the Supreme Court was Yick-Wo v. Hopkins in 1886, which concerned a law that applied to public laundries in the late 19th century San Francisco. It was also an early civil rights case in that the ordinance applied mainly to Chinese laundries, and so on that basis, the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. But there were two elements which converged in New York City at the turn of the 20th century, which led to the very first zoning ordinance as we know it. These were the desire by the fancy Fifth Avenue retailers moving up from the south. These were the desire by the fancy Fifth Avenue retailers to prevent the encroachment of garment factories, which were moving up from the south, and the appearance of the skyscraper, which was made possible by the invention of the steel frame and the elevator. Now, although it was not the first Manhattan skyscraper, in 1915, General Thomas Coleman DuPont began construction of the Equitable Building at 120 Broadway. Its dimensions were spectacular. It covered an entire city block of Broadway between Pine and Cedar Streets and crammed 13,000 workers into its nearly 1.8 million square feet of office space. It was gigantic for its time, and it still is. It cast a long shadow, darkening buildings up to half its height from sunlight. Now, in response, New York City created a Height of Buildings Commission, whose report verged on hysteria as it described the possibility of a serious fire in a tall building and conjured up horrific visions of the panic that would ensue if a disaster discharged the human contents of a skyscraper upon Manhattan's narrow streets. Such calamities were far-fetched, at least until 9/11, but the solution to the somewhat exaggerated problem, amazingly, was zoning. The commission was headed by the brilliant lawyer and reformer Edward N. Bassett, who has been justly hailed as the father of American zoning. He drafted the very first American zoning regulation, which became effective on July 25th, 1916. His oft-repeated concern was for, quote, adequate light and air, unquote, and to prevent the, quote, overcrowding of land, unquote. The New York ordinance required that buildings be set back as they got higher, creating the New York's wedding cake skyline. Now, Bassett was later appointed to head an advisory committee of the Department of Commerce, along with Frederick Law Olmsted, which in 1924 drafted the famous Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, under which municipalities may adopt zoning regulations, and by 1926, more than 425 municipalities had adopted zoning, including Baltimore. In the 19th century, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, most cities were not very pleasant places to live in, and they were often overcrowded with factories, slaughterhouses, and commercial establishments of every variety, cheek by jowl with residences. And so the justification often given for zoning is to prevent noxious industrial uses, such as slaughterhouses, from being close to homes. But this was also an era of overt racism, anti-Semitism, and hostility to foreigners as huge numbers of immigrants arrived and settled in the cities. And as the cities became increasingly the home of the newly arrived, suburbs populated by a homogeneous white middle class offered the hope of a life removed from the ills of the city, and zoning became its weapon of choice. The village of Euclid was and is a suburb of Cleveland along the shores of Lake Erie. Its southern border, Euclid Avenue, was a main thoroughfare out of Cleveland and was once known as Millionaire's Row. But in the 1920s, industrialization was creeping eastward, and many of the mansions were being converted into apartments. And like the Fifth Avenue merchants in the decade before, the residents of Euclid saw in zoning a way to protect their existing land use. And so its village council, James Metzenbaum, who also happened to live on Euclid Avenue, drafted a zoning ordinance. It was very convoluted, with 6 different classes of use districts, 3 classes of height districts, and 4 classes of area districts. But we would still easily recognize it today. In 1912, a firm, Ambler Realty, bought 68 acres along Euclid Avenue in which it planned to develop industrial uses. But the 1922 ordinance only permitted residences. Now, Ambler argued that if its property could be developed industrially, it would be worth $10,000 per acre. But were it restricted to residential, the market value would only be $2,500 per acre. And the issue, of course, was whether the loss of the land's value was a compensable taking under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, nor shall private property be taken without just compensation. The case reached the Supreme Court, which was extremely conservative at the time, which in a surprising 6-3 opinion, authored by Associate Justice George Sutherland, upheld the constitutionality of zoning. Had it not done so, zoning never would have gotten off the ground, and the country would look much different today. The court based its finding on nuisance law, stated famously that a nuisance may be the right thing in the wrong place, like a pig in the parlor instead of the barnyard. And the court found, therefore, that zoning was a constitutional use of the police power, the implied power of the sovereign under the Constitution. The Supreme Court did not take up another zoning case until the Penn Central case in the mid-1960s. And in the ensuing years, zoning spread across the country and has been adopted by nearly every major jurisdiction, with the notable exception of Houston. So this is what you get occasionally in Houston, an erotica shop next to a department store. Now, most communities have followed the Euclid model, dividing their jurisdictions in what have come to be known as Euclidean zones, where uses are either specifically permitted or else prohibited. And so, as a result of the Euclid finding, the principal construct by which land has been developed in America for the last 100 years or so is regulation by use. Odd when you think about it. While the Euclid finding may have been appropriate to address the ills of the Industrial Revolution and the construction in Lower Manhattan, the reach of its unintended consequences cannot be overstated. One cannot understand land use in the 21st century without understanding Euclid. Its 2 main elements are that use is its organizing principle and that its purpose is to prevent the overcrowding of the land. So let's review briefly its basic elements. Land uses under Euclidean zoning, land uses are segregated into classifications. That is single-family residential, multifamily residential, commercial, industrial, etc. Secondly, use is the organizing principle. Uses are either specifically permitted or otherwise prohibited. Some jurisdictions may specifically list over 100 permitted uses in a given zone, but the problem here is when new unanticipated uses develop, as they inevitably do. Solar arrays, for instance, they're not permitted. Last week, we were working with the city of Aberdeen for the first time, and I was very impressed with the simple elegance of Aberdeen's zoning code. It states in their R2 medium residential developments of city-scale character, together with such public buildings, schools, churches, public recreational facilities, and accessory uses as may be necessary, or which are normally compatible within the surrounding uses. This could not be more simple, more commonsensical, or more elegant. Many jurisdictions have lists of uses that go on, and inevitably there's a use that develops that isn't permitted. The second element of Euclidean zoning is that density or intensity is controlled. Bulk is regulated. Bulk is area, is usually minimum area, setbacks, height, lot coverage, et cetera. There are special exceptions and conditional uses, which are uses which are permitted in certain locations but not in others. And almost all zoning codes allow for variances in case of special circumstances or hardship. Now, comprehensive rezoning in Maryland is required to happen at least once every 12 years, wherein the jurisdiction, every jurisdiction must comprehensively look at all its zoning and consider changing it. But in most jurisdictions, comprehensive rezoning is done somewhat more frequently. Baltimore County comprehensively rezones every 4 years, for example. And zoning it's not fully understood by those not in the industry. Zoning is a legislative act, and the municipal legislature can enact any zoning it wants. And so long as it does not become a constitutionally prohibited taking, which is a subject for another talk, it will stand. Now, between comprehensive zoning cycles, it is possible to petition to change a zoning, but the standard that one must show is either a mistake or a change in the character of the neighborhood. There have been many cases as to what constitutes a mistake, but generally an error in judgment, that is, it should be zoned something different than it was, has not been held to be a mistake. It has to be something like a type of graphical error or not consistent with the underlying facts. And the change mistake criteria to change zoning is called the Maryland rule everywhere in the country except in Maryland. Now, Euclidean zoning also contains special exceptions, which are usually called conditional uses in most jurisdictions. And these uses, which are those which are only permitted under certain circumstances, generally after meeting a particular burden. In Baltimore County, that test is found in section 502.1 of the Baltimore County zoning regulations, which is taken almost verbatim from the 1916 New York City ordinance. The requirement for special exceptions in Maryland was articulated by the Court of Appeals in a famous case, which if you practice in this area, should know, Schultz v. Pritz, a 1981 case. And an applicant for a special exception has the burden of providing testimony that shows his or her proposal meets all the prescribed standards and requirements for special exceptions in that jurisdiction. But in order to defeat a special exception, such as a funeral home in a residential neighborhood in the Schultz case, it must be shown that the particular use of that particular location would have adverse effects, quote, above and beyond those inherently associated with such a special exception use, irrespective of its location in the zone. Just because you don't want to live next to a funeral home doesn't mean that that can be defeated. To defeat the funeral home in a residential neighborhood, it has to be at such a location at that particular location that the uses are particularly inappropriate. Now, also, to provide some flexibility and to allow zoning to pass constitutional muster, it is usually possible to obtain a variance in cases of special hardship from strict compliance with the zoning ordinance. And variances are also governed by a very strict standard, which you probably should know, outlined by the Court of Appeals of Maryland in a case called Cromwell v. Ward from 1995. And the general rule is that variances are to be given very sparingly and only under special circumstances. The first requirement for a variance is that the circumstances with respect to the property in question must be unique. The second requirement is that there be an unreasonable hardship or practical difficulty or similar words to that effect. And the hardship must relate to a particular property and cannot be self-created. So in order for there to be a grant of a variance, there must be some condition unique to the property in question, such as shape, configuration, or topography, wherein there would be an unreasonable hardship or practical difficulty if strict compliance with the ordinance was required. Now, the great irony of Euclidean zoning, I think, is that places which are the most pleasant and desirable to live in, Annapolis, Leesburg, Old Town Alexandria, Charleston, Saratoga, for example, these are prohibited, or land planning similar to them are prohibited by Euclidean zoning codes. The pattern of Main Street development is not particularly complex. Mixed use, mixed income, apartments and offices above retail, moderate density, pedestrian scale, vehicles permitted but not allowed to dominate, buildings built with attention to size, mass, scale, and often style, and a streetscape design almost as an outdoor room, creating a sense of place. Now, the Main Street model lives on deep in our cultural memory. And for instance, people pay very dearly to visit Disney's evocation of small town Main Street, but this model of development is generally prohibited by Euclidean zoning codes. Most of the country, in fact, is zoned for single-family detached homes, typical 1 per acre. And this is a graphic from the Atlantic Monthly entitled "The Zoning Inspector's Field Day of Violations," showing how all the elements of traditional American town planning are prohibited by Euclidean zoning codes. Office and retail must be separated from residential uses. Apartments, townhouses, and single family can't be sited together. Each lot must have its own parking and usually too much of it. And the design is vehicularly dominated and pedestrian unfriendly. Now, each residence must be for one single family unit, as density is a key element of control. Granny flats and in-law apartments are generally prohibited. And most zoning departments will deny permits for any house with 2 kitchens under the theory that they could be used by 2 families. And so when mom or dad are too old to care for themselves and they can't move in with the kids in their own apartment and are shuffled off to a senior community, and junior too can't have his own apartment either. In fact, the requirement to segregate uses comes right out of the Ambler 1926 opinion. Quote, what is really the crux of zoning is the creation and maintenance of residential districts from which business and trade of every sort are excluded. Now, just after a century of Euclidean zoning, most America lives in what could be termed the suburban sprawl model, or perhaps the traditional suburban design. This, together with the national preference for single-family homes, spreads everything out, chews up the countryside, and is the leading cause of sprawl. Now, it's not as if the shortcomings of Euclidean zoning have gone unnoticed. As author James Howard Kunstler famously said, American cities are dismal. The newer suburban subdivisions are dismal too. Their architectural shortcomings aside, these places are dismal because the public realm which binds them together is degraded, incoherent, ugly, and meaningless. But Euclidean zoning is now so entrenched in the fabric of America that it's like a vampire. You can't kill it, and it sucks the life out of the countryside. Euclidean zoning, in my view, is perhaps the biggest cause of the housing affordability crisis, but there is another, perhaps less obvious cause, and that is the rise of urban growth boundaries. Maryland has a series of laws: smart growth, priority funding areas, smart green and growing initiative, and URDL lines, urban rural demarcation lines, which are intended to preserve rural and agricultural areas and direct development to urban areas. Now, while there is typically little objection to the preservation of agricultural land, the opposition to more density in existing neighborhoods is, of course, often fierce. The goal of an urban growth boundary is to stop sprawl, but in fact, the opposite is often true, and these have also exacerbated the affordability crisis. Now, the classic case is the much heralded urban growth boundary around Portland, Oregon. That urban growth boundary was first drawn in 1979 by Metro, a 3-county, 24-city regional planning body that helps direct land use decisions in the Portland metropolitan statistical area. And it was designed to protect farmland from sprawl. Since it began, the boundary has only begun by 14%, while the population within it has grown 61%. And therein lies the cause of Portland's homelessness problem, which is now the very worst in the nation. When the boundary was originally established, median home prices in Portland were approximately the national average of $63,000. But Metro Portland's median home prices have skyrocketed and are now 90% above the national average. It's estimated that there are now 14,000 chronically homeless in Portland. Is this any surprise? In fact, the urban growth boundary, which was designed to prevent sprawl, has actually promoted it. Two of Oregon's fastest growing cities, Sandy and Canby, sit about 10 miles outside of the urban growth boundary, and just 8 miles north of Portland across the about 8 miles north of Portland, across the Columbia River, is Vancouver, Washington, whose population has nearly quadrupled since 1990. And so folks are working in Portland, but residing in commuter suburbs beyond the limits of the boundary. And because the densities in Portland haven't increased, the cost of housing has skyrocketed. Closer to home, much of northern Baltimore County lies outside the URDL, the urban rural demarcation line, which is an urban growth boundary and is zoned as low as 1 lot for every 50 acres. Yet Hunt Valley is a major employment center, and so many folks have good jobs in Hunt Valley and nearby Lufton and commute from southern York County where desirable housing is affordable. I-83, which was once an uncrowded country byway, is now gridlocked at rush hour and often not at rush hour. Now, while Euclidean zoning is by far the most prevalent in the United States, there are other types of zoning codes. One is performance impact zoning, whereas traditional land use zoning specifies what land uses land can be put to within specified districts. Performance zoning specifies the intensity of the land that is acceptable. Then there's incentive zoning. Incentive zoning is a zoning in which an incentive such as a relaxation in zoning restrictions are offered to a developer for providing public benefits like building a desired public improvement or building in an area that requires economic development. This is also called bonus zoning. Then there's inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning refers to municipal and county planning ordinance that require a given share of new construction to be affordable by people with low to moderate incomes. There are also planned unit developments. Now, these are adopted in most jurisdictions. Typically, they have some constraints on them, but in many jurisdictions, it's completely let's make a deal. These can be alternative zoning processes where you can negotiate with the government and the zoning authority to have community benefits. And basically, in some cases, you can write your own zoning codes. Now, traditionally, these have been applied to large master plan communities, but not always. And in Baltimore County, they are very widely used. And it can be very much, let's make a deal. If you can convince the county council person of the how good your proposal is, and you could work it out with an appropriate community benefit, you can also get this approved. But the first three on this list are really just variations of the theme on Euclidean zoning. The real advance in the zoning world is form-based zoning, which is an outgrowth of traditional neighborhood design and the new urbanism movement, which began in the late 1980s and which has moved away from having use as the organizing principle. Now, form-based zoning uses physical form rather than the segregation of uses as its organizing principle. These codes address the relationship between building facades in the public realm, the scale and types of streets, and the form and mass of buildings in relation to one another. They designate the appropriate form and scale of buildings and therefore the character of the intended development rather than specific land uses regulated under conventional Euclidean codes. Form-based regulations establish public realm standards, including sidewalks, traffic lanes, on-street parking, street trees, and sometimes street furniture. And unlike Euclidean zoning, which focuses on individual properties, form-based codes try to create a cohesive urban environment that allows for an appropriate mixture of uses. There have been some very fine examples. Here is one community with a strong, structured, pedestrian-friendly streetscape. Here is another award-winning example, Plaza Real in Boca Raton, Florida. And the new Baltimore City zoning code is in many ways a form-based code, and we shall see how that works out. Now, single-family detached housing is by far the most popular in America. It accounts for 75% of all land zoned residential in Los Angeles and 94% in San Jose, just for example. But the affordability crisis has become so severe that there are the beginnings of a backlash against Euclidean zoning and codes that permit only single-family housing. Areas that might once have opposed new construction are now seeking ways to house more people, and two very promising concepts are that of the missing middle and upzoning. Upzoning, not to be confused with rezoning, is a technique to change the codes to increase the buildable capacity of land with denser construction. Now, the missing middle is a concept used to describe a range of multifamily or clustered housing types that are compatible in scale with single-family or traditional neighborhoods. The term missing middle is meant to describe housing types that were common in the pre-World War II United States, such as duplexes, row homes, and courtyard apartments, but are now largely missing. Rather than focus on the number of units in a structure, missing middle housing emphasizes scale and mass that are appropriate for single-family neighborhoods. The term missing middle housing was first introduced by architect Daniel Parolek in 2010. Many forms of what is now described as missing middle housing were built before the 1940s, including two flats in Chicago, row homes in Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and of course, Baltimore, two-family homes or triple-decker homes in Boston, and bungalow courts in California. Missing middle housing comes in a variety of building types and densities, but is characterized by walkability, lower perceived density, smaller building footprints, and less parking. Missing middle housing forms may include side-by-side duplexes, stacked duplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, and bungalow courts, among others. These building types are often perceived as being less dense because of their smaller scale. Missing middle housing offers more choice in housing selection while fitting in with existing single-family neighborhoods. These units are typically smaller than single-family homes and usually share a lot, which results in lower per unit land costs and more affordable housing. These types of units are often characterized as gentle density, focusing on the missing middle housing, somewhere between single-family detached and mid-rise multifamily. They can add density without significantly changing the character of the neighborhood. Fair housing advocates predict that permitting more diverse housing choices, such as missing middle housing, will reduce historic inequities that keep less affluent people out of certain amenity-rich areas. They're right, but it remains to be seen how much political opposition there will be. Several states have adopted or proposed legislation aimed at increasing the stock of missing middle housing. Last year, Maryland considered House Bill 1406, the Planning for Modest Home Act of 2020, which would have required certain areas which are affluent, transit adjacent, and or near a large number of jobs to permit missing middle housing. Many communities throughout the United States are implementing at least some zoning reforms to support missing middle housing. Notable examples include Sacramento, California, which voted to permit up to 4 housing units on all residential lots and reduce parking requirements. Minneapolis passed Plan 2040 in October 2019, which allows duplexes and triplexes in all single-family neighborhoods. Oregon passed House Bills 2001 in July 2019 to allow duplexes in all single-family detached land in cities with populations more than 10,000. And several other states have considered but not yet adopted similar legislation, including Illinois and Virginia. Some communities have not adopted regulations to permit the full range of missing middle housing, but have made changes to permit so-called accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. An accessory dwelling unit is a smaller independent residential dwelling unit located on the same lot as detached single-family homes. ADUs go by many different names throughout the US, including accessory apartments, secondary suites, granny flats, and carriage homes. ADUs can be converted portions of existing homes, that is, internal ADUs, addition to new or existing homes, that is, attached ADUs, or new standalone accessory structures, or converted portions of existing standalone accessory structures. Internal, attached, and detached ADUs all have the potential to increase housing affordability, both for homeowners and tenants, create a wide range of housing options, enable seniors to age in place with family, and facilitate better use of the existing housing fabric in established neighborhoods. Many jurisdictions, including Vermont and New Hampshire, have supported ADUs in their plans and adopted zoning regulations to permit them in low-density residential neighborhoods. In October 2019, California enacted Assembly Bill 68, which permits 1 ADU and 1 junior ADU on lot zone for single-family detached housing. Now, last week, President Biden announced the next priority in his legislative agenda, a huge $2 trillion infrastructure proposal to transform the built environment of the United States. Its scope is breathtaking, with billions of dollars for roads, bridges, public transit, passenger rail and freight rail, and water systems, among many other projects. But if you dig down, it also includes a roughly $213 billion affordable housing initiative to target exclusionary zoning laws that the administration says have inflated housing and construction costs and lock millions of families out of areas of opportunity. The administration notes the recent shortages have been exacerbated by record low mortgage rates and the effect of COVID. Now, according to the White House, the program would award, quote, flexible and attractive funding to jurisdictions that take concrete steps eliminating needless barriers to affordable housing, unquote, and will compensate for the cost of burdens of new construction, such as increased traffic. But, quote, how much would a local politician need to compensate residents to or survive politically by approving a higher density plan, unquote, asks Joseph Gayurko, a finance professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, let's hope that the president's initiative is successful, but forgive me if I remain skeptical because Count Euclid is very hard to kill. Nonetheless, there's a growing backlash throughout the country against the strictures and unintended consequences of Euclidean zoning. It's slow, but change is afoot. But where is Buffy when we need her to put a stake through the heart of the Euclidean vampire? And in the meantime, please pass the garlic. Thank you all and happy developing. Carrie, are there any questions?
If anyone has a question, they can raise their hand, come off mute, put it in the chat. We'll just give it a minute here.
Can you have me? Okay. A question, why is Euclidean zoning so hard to change? I wish I knew. I just don't understand why it is so deeply embedded in the landscape and the fabric of America. But the way our landscape and our suburbs look today, individually, they might be very nice, but there's really no public realm that properly ties them together, and they're spread out way too far. There have been many attempts what we should do is throw it out and start all over again, but it's been impossible. And so I really think the best alternative is to nibble at the edges with alternative zonings that we've talked about, with upzonings and with alternative dwelling units. Andres Duany, the famous Miami-based architect with traditional neighborhood design, really took a run at it, but Count Euclid has really proved to be among the undead. You just can't kill him.
I did get a message from Ben Sage, and they can't hear me, so I'll relay it to you. Seems like planners and county departments have quite a bit of influence as well. It was just a comment from Ben Sage. I don't know if you want to tell them.
Well,
Did they hear me?
I would, am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay, I love Ben, but he's one of my favorite go-to resources. If you ever want to know something statistically about housing, Zonda and Ben are your guy. But I would disagree a little bit. I think it's the political process that's most influential. The planning departments and the planners really have to implement the codes, the zoning codes, to the best of their ability. And that is really a challenge. They do not have a lot of flexibility. Otherwise, they're going to end up in court. And I think this is a legislative process, and changing zoning really always goes back to the city council or the county council or the state legislature, for that matter, which we'll hear more about next time. I have another question. What about text amendments? Okay, well, the saving grace and the horror of Euclidean zoning is really text amendments. So Euclidean zoning is a long list of uses that you can do or you can't do. Well, new things come up all the time. You can, other than the really elegant zoning code in Aberdeen, you just can't anticipate them all. We're doing a lot of work for solar fields, and whoever would have anticipated that, a couple of years ago. And so what is often done is a thing called text amendments. So you go to your county council and you ask them to amend the zoning code to permit whatever it is you want to do. The zoning department sometimes called these buddy bills, and while they may solve a particular problem, after years and years and years of doing these zoning codes are often massive loose leaf documents with internal conflicts and are very convoluted. So when you're in a bind, you can often do a text amendment to get around these strictures of a Euclidean zoning ordinance, but over time, it really causes a problem. I have another question, M. Why isn't, and this question really comes from Mike Wiley. I thought it was an excellent question, and it came last week. And I'm going to ask he sort of asked, what are the limits to regulatory takings? What can the jurisdiction do to you? How much regulation can they put on before it becomes impermissible? And a related question is, why isn't a downzoning a compensable taking? So if the government came in and took 3/4 of the value of your property for a road or a park or something, they have to pay you under the Fifth Amendment. But if they took 3/4 of the value of your property by downzoning you from industrial to residential, as it was in the Euclid v. Amber case, they don't have to pay you. And why is that? And the answer is that downzoning, the Supreme Court held that to be a proper exercise of the police power. And the police power is the power to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And when the legislature acts in accordance with the police power, it doesn't have to compensate you. If it expropriates your property for a new road or whatever, it has to pay you just a compensation. We are going to wrap up this part of the series by Memorial Day, and I think we're going to pick up again in September after Labor Day. And I really want to address that issue much more, which is what are the limits of regulation? And I think I'd like to give a talk called My Take on Regulatory Takings and really get into this a little more deeply. And we'll have some more sessions that I hope you'll find very interesting. Carrie, do you have anything else? That was last week's question. What's his new?
So Mike said to everybody in the chat that you can all see, but David really probably can't because he's in presenter mode. Mike said our automobile-oriented society is many times considered you would probably know this word, an anathema to new urbanism planning principles. Do you have an opinion on the adoption of flexible zoning forms being tied to the reduction of reliance on the automobile and more on pedestrian and or transit-oriented development?
Well, that's a great question, as always. That's a great question, as always, from Mike Wiley, terrific surveyor and engineer up in Frederick with Wormald. It is, ironically, if you will, almost unbelievably, these suburbs look the way they look, spread out and car dominated. You can't get back to work but with a long commute because that's the way we want them to. It's everything, almost everything is zoned Euclidean, and the purpose of Euclidean zoning is to, quote, prevent overcrowding of the land. Now, that might have been great in lower Manhattan in 1916, but I really don't think it's wonderful for Baltimore City today, which used to be 960,000 residences when I grew up there, and now is probably under 600,000. And the consequences of sprawl are large. COVID is now over, and I've been in 2 traffic jams on the Beltway. The traffic jams are back for the last 2 days. Why? Because people live in single-family neighborhoods typically, and then commute using the Beltway to work. So the new urbanism, I believe, is on the right track, traditional neighborhood design, but for some reason you can't kill Euclid. He's the undead. He lives on forever. And so the solution is to nip around the edges, to allow a multi-use, to allow townhouses to be in the same area as singles, to mix income levels. And you have to make relatively minor changes, in my opinion, to the zoning, because as much as we would like to, we can't get rid of it. I do not believe. So, Mike, I think that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. Carrie, we have anything else?
No, just remind them that the link for the future series is in the chat.
Well, thank you, everybody. We're going to go every other Tuesday through Memorial Day. Lori Graff will be our special guest next time. She'll talk about navigating the treacherous shoals of the legislative process and the new legislation related to land development in Maryland. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope we'll see you next time.